So as we have heard at the summit, the source of all too many contemporary and historical conflicts can be traced back to religious roots. Conflicts in Iraq, Iran, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Sudan, Ukraine, Yemen, and China are some current examples, and we're going to hear more from our distinguished panelists. So on behalf of the Bruderhof, I'm Johann Huleatt, and I serve as the Outreach Director for our church communities, and convening and moderating this panel today has been a joy and honor. And just really quickly, after World War I and during World War II, Bruderhof experienced what the impact of war is on religious freedom, and that is the topic of what we're going to be discussing today. First, the fledgling movement became war refugees when the National Socialist regime took control of Germany in the mid-1930s, and then during World War II in England, when the Home Office threatened to detain the German Bruderhof war refugees as enemy aliens. Similar to what George Fox once said and told Oliver Cromwell, the Bruderhof simply wishes to live such a life that would take away the occasion for war. What's past is prologue, so today, here we are to celebrate and protect religious freedom. As Dr. Farr wrote in his book, The World of Faith and Freedom, a growing body of scholarly work is adducing evidence that religious freedom is the key element in a set of bundled freedoms. Political liberties, such as free speech and assembly, without which democracies cannot mature and survive, let alone flourish. To apply an analogy from the Aristotelian virtue ethics, just as wisdom is the meta-virtue that adjudicates virtue conflicts, so religious freedom is the meta-freedom of all the others that are fundamental, inalienable, and inherent. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers in their speaking order. So to begin with, we have Ms. Tina Ramirez, and she is the founder and president of Hardwired Global, a nonprofit organization that specializes in human rights, education, and training to promote peace and pluralism worldwide. Tina brings to Hardwired more than 20 years of experience as an educator, policy advisor, and expert on international human rights and religious freedom. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you, Johann, and it's so great to be with you all. I know that there's many more joining us live, so I will try not to forget you. It's difficult to talk about the impact of war on religious freedom without talking about almost the opposite of that, which is the impact of religious communities in conflict and the religious dimension of conflict. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, because I think it's often ignored. And in particular, when it comes to the country that I'm going to speak about, which I'll name in a minute. I'm glad that Johann didn't give it away. So let me just go back a little bit and say Hardwired was founded in 2013, so almost 9 years ago. And I started it because I believed this proverb that some of you may have heard about, which is that if you want a tree today, you needed to plant it 10 years ago, right? And I think with what all of us see is a rise in global conflict, much of which is rooted in religious divisions and hatred and intolerance and discrimination. Planting that tree 10 years ago or 9 years ago to provide a place to train leaders in countries that can promote the fundamental freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief within their own cultural and religious and political climates was really critical to ensuring that there is greater peace and stability and freedom in the world for all people. And so that was the seed that I planted almost 10 years ago now, and I am really grateful to see what's come of that, and I'll share a little bit about that in the country that I'm going to share about. But this idea of hardwired is that we're all hardwired to be free, that our most fundamental freedom is essentially our freedom of conscience, our ability to believe in whomever, whatever we want, to have that religious impulse that's inside of us be free to determine ultimate truths of reality. And because we are all hardwired for that freedom, and I believe it's one of our most fundamental freedoms, that's often the freedom that governments and societies are going to attack first if they want to control you and your ability or allegiance to fall in line, let's say, with the political establishment and order. And so that's why we see around the world today that religious freedom, really, and the freedom of thought, conscience, belief is the most targeted and affected freedom in the world when it comes to conflict. And nowhere is that more prevalent than a few of the countries that we're going to hear about today. But in one of the countries, I just want to share a few things. So if I named the country I was going to talk about, you would easily have a picture and maybe discount everything else I'm going to say. So I want you to imagine this is a country that is not a country of particular concern under the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the State Department's, or the State Department's actual designation. The Commission, I think, has recommended it. It's a democratic country. It's a very pluralistic country. It's one of the most wealthiest countries in its region. And in 2050, it will be the third largest country in the world. Great country, right? Sounds wonderful. I mean, it could be America, right? A month ago, a group of, it was about a month ago, a group of 100 armed men attacked a young woman because she was writing on her social media post about a difference in political and religious opinion related to something. They said this is blasphemy. The local security at the university put her in a cage to kind of protect her. And unfortunately, the mob pushed through, and they poured oil and gas on her as she was in there to try to burn her alive. That didn't work. Finally, they pushed through the security guard, grabbed her, and took her around the side and stoned her to death. Not a great model of a democracy or pluralistic society, is it? All because they had a difference of religious opinion. A couple months ago, or not even a month ago actually, on Pentecost Sunday, it was June 5th, I believe, a Catholic church in a town in this country was just brutally attacked. I think over 40 worshipers, innocently worshiping, died and were murdered. Over the last year, we've seen a 15% increase in violence against people of different faiths, whether they're Christian or Muslim. I could go on and on and on with the list. Let me just, before I tell you what country it is, share that over about 20 years ago, we saw these things happening. So when I went to work for the U.S. Congress in 2007, I guess, one of the top priorities someone shared with me is, Tina, you've got to deal with Nigeria. Don't. You've got to deal with this country. And I'm like, okay, so we did hearings. We finally did hearings on it. And we started drawing attention to it, but nobody cared. They're like, why? It's a democracy. No one cares. And I'm like, look, there's something happening here. Across the state, people were going to universities and starting to attack innocent kids on campus just because of differences in opinion. I'm like, that doesn't just happen when you're looking at indicators of violence. There's something else going on. And kids on a campus aren't in their community fighting over land and turf or political opinions. They're in a university far away from that, right? So that was happening, and then in 2008 we held a hearing on it, and we talked about the problems, and I visited this country. And a week after I left, in the town where I was, and I visited all of the northern parts of this country where all this violence and stuff were happening, I saw firsthand what was really going on. And I came back, I did a hearing, and literally like a week after I got back, violence erupted in the city where I stayed, and it was one of like the worst violent election periods in this nation's history. And like, there is something going on. Literally a month later, there was a man from this country that got on an airplane after being radicalized and landed in Detroit, Michigan, and tried to detonate a bomb in his underwear. So now you definitely know which country I'm talking about. This is the infamous underwear bomber of Nigeria. So when I give you this background, now that was 2008. 2009, we started having hearings and paying attention to this rise of extremism in this country. And we go for a couple years and then we start ignoring it. But since 2009, you've had tens of thousands of people, okay, I got 1 minute. You have tens of thousands of people that have literally been attacked and killed and murdered. And somehow, last year, our government, our State Department, says that this is not a country of particular concern. There's nothing going on there. I've seen this before. I've seen this play before. What I can tell you from what I saw in 2008 on the ground there, and then after working there in the country, bringing together Muslim and Christian lawyers in 20 of the northern states, including Abuja, is that there's something very deeply wrong going on there. And if that religious dimension of the conflict is ignored any further, we are going to see one of the most important democratic, pluralistic, not truly pluralistic though, countries in the world completely fail and fall apart, and we really can't afford that in this world. When we ignore the religious dimension of conflict, because Deborah Emanuel and all of those others that were murdered were not murdered for any other reason than their religion. They weren't murdered because of climate change, which is what our government wants us to believe. Then we really ignore the ability to actually affect the root cause of the problem and help people be more free in the future. And that's really why we're here today, because we don't want war. We don't want conflict to destroy people in their religious freedom, but unless we address the root causes, which are sometimes religious in nature, we will never get there and never help people find freedom. Thank you.
Okay, this is working. Tina, thank you very much. And next we have Dr. Eric Patterson, and Eric serves as the Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute, and he is the Scholar at Large in Pasadena at the Robertson School of Government at Regent University, and a Research Fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Johann. And my thanks to Johann, Huleatt, and to Bruderhof for co-sponsoring, really being the lead sponsor of this panel today. They're great friends. He serves on RFI's advisory board. Thank you. Let me just pick up something that Tina said and then tell a short story. Tina was talking about how important it is for our analysis to carefully look at what you might call the variables or the factors that are religious but also not religious in any specific case of violence. And the same is true for peace, for religious informed peace building. And I just mentioned that one of our books, Politics in the Religious World, has a whole chapter laying out what are those factors you look at for peace or for war that are religious versus what are not religious. And if your birthday is today or this week, you can have this copy. Who is it? Raise your hand. Whose birthday is today or this week? That's right. All right. There you go. At the end today. Now, with that, let me tell a quick story. My country is Iraq. You'll know it immediately. I can't hold it back from you like Tina did. In the Iraq case, a decade ago, I was there for an academic conference. Actually, I just left studying for the State Department. I was there as a professor, actually. And after a week in Erbil, in that area, one night I was at dinner with a young man and a group of other faculty from the United States. And one of the faculty said, why can't you guys just forgive and forget and move on? Now this was 2010. This is actually before the utter destruction caused by ISIS. And this young man said, you know, I was educated in the West. I think I could probably do that, but let me tell you my story, and then you tell me if you think you can forgive and forget. When he was 7, the helicopters came to his town. His father came running in the front door. The helicopters are coming. They're shooting our houses. Run. Don't take anything. Go. Run out the back door. So this 7-year-old boy took his 4-year-old sister on his back, fled to the foothills, and hid in the mountains. And he wasn't found by his parents for 3 days. He had many cousins and aunts and uncles and friends from their village who were massacred in one of Saddam Hussein's many, many purges. So he said, could you forgive and forget? You white Westerners keep telling us what we're supposed to do, which is forgive and forget. Could you do that? And he said, I think that my kids maybe, or my grandchildren, might be able to forgive and move on. And so with that framing, as we think about Iraq, you all know about it. You've seen it in the news for your entire life. That was a fast 6 months. You've all seen it in your life. I'm not going to tell you about Iraq. What I'm going to do is just focus in on what can be done to overcome religion, what I call religion exacerbated violence. Usually people aren't fighting over theology or faith. It's usually political cleavages, financial cleavages, power cleavages that are along, in the Iraqi case, that are on ethno-religious lines. And really, I'd say that there's 2 fulcrum points if we're going to see change there. One is with elites, and one is with kids and students, because that's where culture changes. Elites help shape it, and it's really over generations that you can get at this. Unfortunately, many political and religious elites have used religion as a wedge issue rather than as what we in the United States would say is a e pluribus unum issue, out of many, one large, diverse people. So I want to tell you actually about a couple of points of light, both for kids and for elites, and it's work that needs to be supported and move forward. So let me tell you about Hardwired. I used to be on Tina's board, and I have seen her work on the ground. One of the things that they have is they have a set of curriculum, teacher training, and accompanying kids' storybooks that are on the value of living in a pluralistic society and how that's a beautiful thing like a garden, not a terrible thing. And enough of that happening, it needs to be reinforced in the home, of course, right? It needs to be reinforced in society. But with their teachers training and kids' books, it's a very, very powerful thing that you need at every level. In our case, at R5, we have a new virtues curriculum for kids that'll come out later this year in English. One for Muslims, one for Jewish kids, one for Christian kids. It's based on the virtues of their traditions, like patience and kindness. And the storybooks and the curriculum and teachers training was around this. How do you have civility and citizenship in a society? Well, you start with actually the virtues in our own faith tradition. That's how you train kids in school, and it's reinforced in the home, and that's how we're kind of in an accompanying role to that work. This year, we'll train over 3,000 college students through our FI's religious freedom training programs for college professors and for students at 4 Iraqi universities. And this is building on a program for 500 students last year. What about adults and elites? I mean, we're not going to change every elite's views that would try to use religion as a wedge issue in the politics of Iraq. But I will say this, Hardwired, as an example, has a 3-day immersive training for elites, teachers, politicians, judges. I have participated in that. It is really hard. It is a complex, complicated, it's not easy to scale up, but it is a transformative experience that takes people who are former adversaries and gets their story out on the table and helps them then to move on to see the other, not as their buddy, but as a potential partner to just live beside in the future. In our FI's case, we have a set of programs and consultations with teachers, with professors, with lawyers and with government officials that I'd love to tell you more about sometime. But let me just close by this. If I were asked if I could give 2 or 3 recommendations to good-hearted Iraqis, which most are, about what are the kinds of things that would really make a difference in the country going forward, let me mention a couple of practical ones. Number 1, for those who are kind of Iraq followers, rebuild Mosul. Now, a major Iraqi city was a major headquarters for ISIS. It's essentially bombed to the ground, and over the past 4 years, there's been almost no investment by the Iraqi government. And it has a unique history. It's been kind of in and out of the hands of different groups. It would be ground zero for a pluralistic approach that said all of our different faith and ethnic traditions. This is a key city that goes back thousands of years, and the government needs to rebuild all of the houses of worship, from the small Jewish community to the Christians to the Sunni to the Shia. Most will be this could be a symbolic. There's times where there's a symbolic moment in politics. I'll mention a second one beyond these education programs and things. What's pretty rare in Iraq and in that part of the world is when a house of worship is rebuilt after it's been razed to the ground, is for the religious leaders from the other communities and political leaders from the other communities to go to the grand opening. What made Iraqi headlines about 20 years ago was when the Kurdish leader who became the president of Iraq, Johann H, presided in a sense over the reopening of a Shia mosque. It made national headlines across Iraq. It was on their radio talk shows. A couple of senior Shia clerics commented on what a powerful symbol this was. A similar thing happens in Jamaica, of all places, where there's a Shia mosque, and religious leaders and political leaders from around the world kind of go. Those acts of leadership by people from different ethno-religious communities are a pretty big demonstration. And in Iraq, it can actually be taking your life into your own hands. But what we haven't had is Iraq Watchers.
And thank you all for coming. So, thank you, Paul, for diving into that topic already a bit. I'm going to extend a bit on the narratives that we currently observe at the war between Russia and the Ukraine.
So as you probably know, usually narratives are always used to legitimize wars and to get people to actually join a war. Because if you don't have that external image of an enemy, probably nobody would go. And that was the same that happened in Russia. And so, yeah, Ukraine is no exemption to that. And what we observed in the last years in Russia is that they have built up several narratives, as Paul already mentioned, and one of them is very closely linked to religious nationalism. And that makes those narratives very dangerous to the extent that religion and nationalism are both very strong identities. So if you engage with those two identities, it's very easy to get into a very severe conflict because it's so emotional usually for people. So what are the other narratives that we heard so far? Probably about, that there is Nazis in Ukraine that need to be eliminated. Also that Russia wants to reestablish this Russian Empire, and about the NATO enlargement. But yeah, we're gonna focus today. I'm gonna focus on the religious narrative that has been used, and it is a narrative that mainly talks about an almost messianic defense of the true Orthodox Christendom and how it can be protected from this hedonistic, increasingly secularistic West. So this is what we've seen Russia engaging in the last months and before that as well. So you would probably wonder how is that connected also to the work that the Observatory is doing. And so the Observatory is mainly focusing on cases of intolerance and discrimination against Christians in Europe. And yes, Ukraine is a part of that, but to be very honest, we have not been focusing on Ukraine in the last years, but more the Western countries of Europe. So there's two main areas on which we focus. The one is hate crimes against Christians, and the other one is the infringement of fundamental rights of Christians in Europe. And when it was a couple of months and weeks before the war started that we have been contacted by several Russian media outlets who requested interviews from us. And we already sensed, okay, there's some tension already, and that's probably not going to be beneficial for our cause and the whole of Europe and the West as well, because they will probably use it for their propaganda. And the biggest problem for us was that, of course, what they're saying about the West is not a lie at all, because it's true that we have those cases. So in our archive, we have over 4,500 cases of intolerance and discrimination against Christians. So it's the truth, but the question is it really the right way to engage with it? And that's basically why we do what we do, because we don't want to get to a level where societies have to clash into a conflict. Because a lot of people always ask us, why do you focus on hate crimes? And one of the reasons is because hate crimes are a very good indicator for current social climate. So usually people don't know that there's 10 times the number of hate crimes that are perpetrated against Christians than other religions. So yes, we do have a problem here, but obviously that's not the way how you deal with it, like we've seen it with Russia, now in Ukraine. So since the war started, we had numerous cases of pastors being kidnapped or priests tortured, killed, numerous churches that have been bombed where we know that people were hiding inside, taking refuge, but also acts of desecration. So where, for example, a cemetery was just completely bombed and desecrated, and yeah. So what we really advocate for is that we are able to live in a society where we can really have those open discussions, not just between the different religions, but really with the state as well, because that's something that we discovered through our observations, is that one of the driving dynamics behind intolerance and discrimination in Europe is what we term secular intolerance. So this secular intolerance is a dynamic that sets off a process of secularization that is driven by an ideology. So it's not secularity in the neutral sense towards religion that safeguards a healthy relationship between the state and religion. But it is very much infused by ideologies that have a very clear anti-religious and also often specifically an anti-Christian bias. So that is the bigger problem. And I think in order for our democracies not to fall into the same traps as with authoritarian regimes, those are the grounds that we need to stand on. We need to defend this. We need to really stand on being inclusive, tolerant, open, and liberal in the actual sense. So what it really means, we can't just use it as labels. Because if we don't stand on those grounds, I think that is what happens. Like what we see in those conflicts is what we see will be the negative consequence of that. We need to be able to talk to each other, engage with the state, and religion needs to stay in the public sphere. It can't be relegated to the private sphere, because it is part of so many people's lives. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Also, thank you for making that journey. And coming from further afield is Mr. Steve Gumaer, coming from Norway. And he founded Patterson Relief and Development along with his wife, Oddny, in 1994. That organization began with the support of one young girl whose village was attacked by the Myanmar army. She is the only known survivor. In 2022, Steve resigned from his position as the president of Partners after 28 years of service to found Novi, a new organization focusing on helping children traumatized by war. Novi's mission is to strengthen children who survive. Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Johann and Bruderhof, for your excellent work, and my fellow panelists for bringing their expertise to this forum. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. As Johann said, I've worked in the ethnic states of Myanmar for the past 28 years, and from the very start of our work, the topic of religious persecution was on the lips of the people we met. One of the first stories I remember hearing was of a pastor whose village was attacked by the Myanmar army, then called Burma, the Burma army. And as they were advancing and the villagers getting word that they were coming, hearing the attack and packing their belongings to flee, the pastor stayed behind and distracted the soldiers so that the villagers would have more time to run. That pastor was captured and reportedly tied to the pulpit of his church and slowly and brutally killed. This story may sound sensational, but human rights groups and media have documented this time and time again. The same theme recurring, especially in Karen State. The Karen capital of Manarpla fell in 1994, the year that my wife and I started working with the Karen. And it fell because there was supposedly a Buddhist priest who was lobbying to build a temple and a pagoda above this capital called Manarpla. The Karen, being both Christian and pluralistic, gave permission for their worship and for their practice, and eventually gave permission, despite the strategic problem of this pagoda being visible from far away, gave permission for the priests to build this pagoda. It was built and then used as a cache for weapons because it wasn't a priest at all, it was an intelligence officer posing as a priest. He and his priesthood, so to say, cached weapons and military hardware and led the attack against Manarpla in 1994, supported by the Burma army, in which Manarpla fell and the Karen resistance had to relocate inside Thailand to continue to lead the resistance. Out of that experience came a group called the DKBA, the Democratic Karen Buddhist Army. They're neither democratic nor Buddhist, but they were heralded by the regime as this, with the mission to protect and stand for the minority Buddhists who were a part of the Karen culture. The Karen are largely Christian. There's 7 million people with a minority population of Buddhists. So the DKBA was co-opted. It was started with funds, actually concessions that were given to some of the Karen leaders, these officers who, in their corruption, left the resistance to become a part of this new proxy. The DKBA was a useful tool to the regime because the regime could blame attacks on the DKBA in the name of Buddhist protection, and the regime could then say that they were involved in peacekeeping operations, and the peacekeeping operations were to stop the Buddhists and the Christians from killing one another. That was what it was about in media. That was picked up by the international press and resulted in a kind of shine campaign for the regime. A variation of the same story happened to the Rohingya in 2012. A terrible event happened in which it was alleged that a Rohingya raped a Rakhine woman. The Rakhine retaliated, and there were retaliations back and forth with terrible murders taking place. In the end, it resulted in a massive riot in which thousands of Rohingya were killed, and the entire population of one large city named Sitwe was marched to a floodplain surrounded by barbed wire and are there to this day. That was in 2012. The brutality and the scale of violence left thousands of people dead and thousands to this day interned in forced relocation camps, and as you may know, over 1 million people fled into neighboring Bangladesh and live in camps there. Again, the regime used religion to polarize people's existing religious tensions and ethnic prejudices against one another. In 2012, a Buddhist monk and puppet of the regime, the Burma Army regime, named Ashin Wiratu led a nationwide movement of Buddhist nationalism. Again, this nationwide movement was aimed at the Muslims, and it coincided with the violence that I mentioned before, initially in 2012 against the Rohingya, and then in Rakhine State, with massive violence leading to an attempted genocide for which Myanmar is still in court about to this day. His campaign was so successful that even Aung San Suu Kyi, the former democratic icon of hope for this country, has quoted things that he has said and talked about religious nationalism, Buddhist nationalism, as a cornerstone of the Burmese way. The landscape in Chin, Kachin, Karenni, Rakhine, and Shan State, virtually all the ethnic states of Myanmar, the same stories are repeated within their cultural and religious context. What is clear is that the violence being done is not because of theological or ideological conviction or creed. It is done as a means to control and dominate. It's a way to gain, preserve, and ensure access to the vast wealth of the country and sustain the power needed to keep control. Last year, in February, a coup took place in Myanmar which changed the landscape dramatically. One of my friends, David Eubank, has also worked in the ethnic states for over 30 years. He says that in Karenni State alone, where there are attacks as of yesterday from the air against these civilian villages, in Karenni State alone, since the coup, there have been over 20 churches hit by airstrikes, mortars, burned, and on 3 occasions civilians were killed inside the churches. That's just since January. Many churches more were hit by machine gun and rifle fire as Burma Army assaults villages. The Burma Army also lays landmines around these churches and homes. And since the coup, over 100 people have stepped on landmines in the villages the Burma Army has laid. The Irrawaddy, a well-regarded publication monitoring Myanmar, on March 28th wrote this: the Myanmar military regime has destroyed more than 100 Buddhist and Christian religious buildings in resistant strongholds in the country's northwest heartland and the southeast since the coup last year. In predominantly Christian Chin State, nearly 35 churches and 15 affiliated buildings were destroyed by junta attacks. I'm out of time, and so what I want to say is that the religion as a way to divide people, as a way to dominate people, as a focal point of violence, because those religious institutions gather people in, and strengthen communities, and also are a place where resistance is planned, even peaceful resistance. In closing, I'll give you a quote. My hope in the restoration of civil society, pluralism, and the tolerance and kindness I have observed in Burma's population my whole adult life. I've asked ethnic leaders what it will take to repair the damage done by the Burma regime. Without exception, they say this: the dictatorship needs to stop their attacks and stop exploiting us. We can fix this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve. And we do have a few minutes if we go into overtime, so if anyone has any questions, please just come forward and raise them. Or at this point, we've hit the 45-minute mark, but go ahead.
This is open to the panel. I was just looking into the future here in terms of all.
You can take a mic.
In terms of what you guys all have discussed, it's more of a futuristic question. But maybe to Ms. Tina Ramirez, since Hardwired is so on top of this. Going into 2024, and you as a public figure out, doing a lot of great work with your organization, Hardwired. Could you give us a synopsis, just your take on going into the election in 2024, what you think in terms of the state of affairs globally, and with all the election coming up, for the next couple years? Thank you very much.
I guess, Tina, the question is, should we put the timer on, or?
No.
Okay.
I'm not going to respond to this politically because I'm here on behalf of Hardwired. So let me just say that when we look at what's happening in the world today, we see a lot more conflict, and conflict that either uses religion or is religiously motivated, and that's something that we've seen in our own work. I think that there is a real need for people to respond to it. One of the exciting things that I will say, and I'm not a Ukraine expert, but that I've seen is the populist response in Ukraine has been so fascinating to watch, because in doing human rights for over 20 years now, I have never seen a public response to a crisis like what we've seen in Ukraine in such a way that really does inspire what, as a human rights person, I'm excited to finally see happening, to really inspire a global movement for what human rights is all about. The world is actually standing up saying this is wrong. In the 20 years of human rights education that I've done, I've never seen that kind of response, a grassroots response. We never really saw it in Iraq. And I know that because when I was in Iraq, they didn't know how to articulate their human rights. In Nigeria, they don't know how to articulate their human rights. But in Ukraine, they do. I mean, I would say in Sudan, they did, and that's why they eventually did overthrow Omar al-Bashir. But that's something for all world governments and leaders to be paying attention to, because I think what's happening in Ukraine does have huge implications.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Tina. I think at this point, our panelists deserve a round of applause. All right, we're gonna have 2 more questions. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. May I have religious obstructions that happen with ethnic minority is it's drive because of the political drive, or it's because of the real conflict between religion. Because the military also brutally attack their own people as well, even though they are Buddhists, the same Buddhists.
I don't think that the Burma Army attacks people because of their religion. They use religion as a means to divide and manipulate, especially since the coup in February. They're attacking indiscriminately, and if they attack churches or Christian or Buddhist shrines or holy places, it's because they are used as a place to mobilize resistance to them. So I very much agree with what I think you asked and said in your question, that it is not because of ideology or creed, and I would argue probably has never been.
Several of you mentioned education materials. Where are they available?
In the case of the Religious Freedom Institute, some of our curriculum can be downloaded right from our website, which is rfi.org or religiousfreedominstitute.org. Or you can send me an email and I'll connect you to the director of our National Center for Religious Freedom Education. And we have some of the curriculum in Spanish, Polish, Arabic, and English.
And Hardwired's curriculum is all online on our website, hardwiredglobal.org, and under the bookstore page you'll find it. You can also talk to my colleague here. We have downstairs a booth with the books that you can actually look at, the children's books. And Eric mentioned them, but we had implemented a training in Mosul and then in Low Plains with the support of the government of Iraq, that we're in the process of retraining all of the teachers there in that region so that the children are able to learn about religious freedom and the human dignity of others and embrace it. And that's what we're already seeing is having the most impact on the culture there, transforming their views of others and actually beginning to break the cycle of conflict in that community. So the teachers that we work that inspired the books. So the children's books downstairs were all inspired by lessons written by teachers in Iraq and in many other countries that have gone through our programs. We launched a project this year called the Peaceful Garden Project, and had an event last month with Kathy Ireland, and was on Newsmax talking about the project and how we are bringing it to the United States. So yes.